Hello everyone, today we talk about the Serbian invasion, settlement and evangelization. I already made a video about the origins of the Serbs, the ethnogenetic theories being naturally apolitical, together with a historical question. So there is that video really. I created a medieval Serbia playlist, by the way, and we will hopefully replenish it soon. Today we talk specifically of the De Administrando Imperio on the Serbs and the, in fact, earlier incursions, the range of the settling and the Christianization. We talked about the De Administrando Imperio for different videos, just the other week about Great Moravia, that incidentally is connected with the issue of the Serbs, because there is a theory basically asserting that the area roughly which the Serbs would have settled was the actual Greater Moravia. And this phase in which at least as we'll see now, the thing is more complex because there were different, let's say, if not waves properly, just a continuity of the settlement process, and it's complicated to distinguish VII from VII, also because, as we've seen, the Iranian origin theory of the Serbs, and so White Serbia, the Polabian, say, space being somehow another story compared to what had been happening, in fact, in the Balkans prior to this Serbian movement. But that's the entire debate, right? And the Administrando Imperio, as we will see now, had, of course, remarkable information on the Serbs. And in the other video, we've seen how this was connected to the possibility, at least in the south, because that's how, at least by the 10th, this is a 10th century source. So by the time the Magyars were already settled in the Hungarian plain, and the Byzantines called them Turks in general for their kind of ethnographic simplifications. But they're pretty clear to say that the two Moravias were fundamentally north and south, respectively, and the latter actually being even substantially larger. As we've seen, 11 settlements for what would have been the northern Moravia, the one that still called like this, and the southern one with 30, right? And referring to, in both cases, as you know, to the Morava River, that would have given the name eventually also to the southern one. It's just an hypothesis for the Greater Moravia, because at least that occurred the 9th century, so when the Magyars had not settled yet, and being literally no boundary, right, politically, between, in fact, the Western and the Southern Slavs. That's another issue we discussed it in the other videos. It's just a theory, because basically it's all we know, as we will see now. However, the Administrando Imperio says quite other interesting things about the Serbs. As you know, this source was composed by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, which includes, by that point, today we will just look at the settlement, right? So mostly at the 7th century, but at that point we were in the 10th, so there was already the early medieval Serbian principality that we will treat in another video. But some properly original, say, ancestral, primitive information about what, how that polity had come about. This work is fundamentally an typically encyclopedistic kind of Byzantine sum about the empire and the various peoples inhabiting it, and the ones also bordering it, of course, just as an instruction, right? Assembled from 948 to 952 for Constantine's son and heir, Romanus II. We talked about those emperors, by the way, in our Byzantine history playlist, if you're interested. And naturally, most of these data were, in fact, instrumental for coping again ethnographically against these peoples that, as we've seen in many other many other episodes, being described thoroughly by the Byzantines, also from a military point of view, in an area like the one that would become, in fact, Serbia, Serbia of the time, that was somehow defiled, right, from most of, from substantially decentralized from Constantinople, right, sheltered in areas that were somehow difficult to penetrate, but that, given the fact that the periphericity of the land would bring the Serbians, generally speaking, to remain within the Byzantine orbit and within, properly on the right bank of the Danube, within the Byzantine Empire, Byzantine territory, right, and clashing against the Bulgarians, etc. So again, these are all things we will see more thoroughly in other videos, because the history is fairly detailed, right, once it starts, right. The Serbs are mentioned in the De Administrando Imperio in the total of 8 chapters from the 29th to the 36th, right? And the most important now we will read the 32nd, titled about the Serbs and the lands in which they dwell today. So the interesting thing here is that the Byzantines, of course, knew much more than we do at the time about the Serbs, and they were also drawing this information from Serbian sources, interestingly enough. And in fact, the works talks about, again, the origins of the people, says that, quote, the Serbs originate from the unbaptized Serbs, also called the White Serbs, right? So this would be the Sorabians, fundamentally north in Central Europe, right? And which live on the other side of Turkey, right? So the concept is being the Turkoi here in Greek. So what Hungary was by that point, because the area had been inhabited by the Huns, by the Avars. So even though the Magyars weren't Turkic prevalently, at least that was the Turkia fundamentally. And speaking about this White Serbs in the land which they called Bojka, close to the Frankish Empire and the Greater Croatia, because as we've seen in the video about the Duchy of Croatia, the Serbs and the Croatians would have been twins here, right? Coming from those same areas of Western Slavic land, known as White Croatia. And as we've seen on the origins of these peoples, there is a strong possibility that even though these people were by this point Slavic, by the majority, of course, they, at least as political conglomeration, had been born through some lordships established by Iranian knights, fundamentally, and their retinues, and the fragmentation, especially of the Sarmatian power under the Hunnic waves, and all the scattering of the Sarmatians, mostly the dominating Alani at that point, as far as Portugal, right? So crossing in Britain and etc. As they had been present also as military units under Rome, and so on. So we will dwell in that kind of world in many ways, even the Arthurian era, or this kind of things in another video, but just know it's all connected, of course. Typically, the emperor describes, as we just said, the Serbian tribe as split in two, right? And one group migrating to the Balkans. So this is how the thing would have technically happened, right? You know that there are lots of issues regarding the Balkan question that is not yet completely solved, but so these topics become very, political as soon as they get ethnic, geographical, historical, and so on. And so there are just theories, because we weren't there, we didn't film, we didn't record the thing, but this is the best we've got, and it's not that, I personally marry the Iranian theory. I don't have much of a problem with that, and it mostly stems also from such source. So let's simply read the Administrando Imperio passage. It says, as two brothers inherited the rule over the Serbs after their father, right? The typical custom that the Slavs had in splitting equally, right? Male hair. One of them, taking a half of the people with him, migrated over to Heraclius, right, Emperor of the Romans, who took him in and gave him the settling location in the theme of Thessalonica, which is since then called Serbia. But after a while, those same Serbs decided to return to their homeland, and the emperor dispatched them. After they crossed the Danube, however, they changed their mind and sent out a note to the Emperor Heraclius through the strategos of Singidunum, that would be today's Belgrade. I made a video on the Skordisky and the Roman conquest, so we will talk about. I'm planning a series on the Roman provinces, so we'll see perhaps Moesia better at that point. In any case, you know what we're talking about in times and space. Singidunum, that they want him to give them another land to settle, right? And since the modern Serbian Pagania and the so-called, so here we're talking about the Narentines, the South Slavic tribe, they occupied an area of southern Dalmatia. We'll see it on another occasion. In any case, in the so-called land of Zaclumia, that was similar, and Travunia, and the land of Konavle remained desolate because of the Avars, who expelled the Romans from there, which now inhabits Dalmatia and Dyrrhachium. The emperor settled the Serbs in these lands, and they were subordinated to the emperor of the Romans. The emperor brought priests from Rome to baptize them and teach them to perform the pious duties in order and display the Christian faith to them, right? So this is a very, harmonized explanation of what happened. As we've seen in the video about the theory of the origins, there are lots of things going on. Here we will at least recover part of this initial disagreement with Heraclius about the place where they would have had to migrate, that there was probably something there going on against the Avars, right, that the Byzantines wanted to exploit by calling these peoples from further away and settling on the frontier. So this is, again, a context we will not go back to, but in other videos, hopefully. This other thing that they called, here when it says they brought priests, the Byzantines brought priests from Rome, it really means Rome, right? It doesn't mean Constantinople. And as we will see, that is also a thing, because, as we were saying before, Serbia was quite decentralized for a substantial, it always was technically, from Constantinople, and basically the land north of the Balkan Mountains, the Danube Valley in general, had historically been much more of a Romance influenced area, and kept eventually with the Franks to receive this Roman Catholic influx, as opposed to the Byzantine Orthodox one in quite consistent ways, right? The local rulers would play shrewdly like this card to, remain ever more kind of autonomous if they could. At least things went back and forth. Another source on early medieval Serbia are the Annales Lauricenses Maiores, that is to say, the Royal Frankish Annals, at least as they are known, by Einhard, right? That records the Serbs for 822 controlling what he called great part of Dalmatia. In Latin it says, ad Sorabos, quae natio magnam Dalmatiae partem obtinere dicitur. Alright, so this is actually the oldest historical record which mentions the Serbs, right, by giving some details about them, at least. And here, Dalmatia is not necessarily what the Franks conceived Dalmatia like, so part of the coast of the historical region, but also the hinterland, right? And especially we'll see it now. And it was their, just again, the terminology is not ultra precise, and the Serbs were naturally even more distant from the Frankish heartland than Constantinople. There are mistakes, naturally, in the Administrando Imperio, anachronisms, so now we're not going to philologically, historically descend into that. As we've seen, the original settlement in the theme of Thessalonica, for example, is a bit weird because that theme had been created a century and a half after the reign of Heraclius, as the source states. But here, Heraclius, as you know, ruled in the early 7th century, so the question, it's not even so important, because naturally Constantine VII was just reasoning in terms as if those themes had maybe not always been there, but generally speaking, they called the place like that. So even in Heraclius' times, it's Byzantine literature. They were just applying this kind of categorism to things that had not been existing, but doesn't matter. Really, it's not much of a deal. But it's actually accurate in as much as we will see the Serbs, together with other Slavs, were surely settled in some of those areas as well, and they poured even as south as the Peloponnese. The Byzantines even deported some of them to Asia Minor, Anatolia. So it adds up in general, right? It's accurate, it's plausible at least. The Administrando Imperio, by the way, states that the term Slav, for example, that, as you know, stems from glory, from the ecumenic imperial ideology of the Indo-Europeans in Slavic, and that here instead is attributed to the Latin sclavus, and specifically actually for the Serbs, properly Serbi, so Serbs, and that's how they at least made their own ethnonymy. But what do we know about the actual times and places in the 7th century? Because that's where really Serbia began, right? So, as we've seen, the source states, Constantine says that the Serbs settled in the Balkans during the time of Heraclius, reigning between 610 and 641. Hell of a time, by the way, because as you know, those were the years of the Persian Wars. Heraclius crushed the Sasanians, apparently once for all, but the empire was overwhelmed by the Arab invasions, so that it lost basically, on the longer run, a half of its size. And here other peoples from the Balkans took advantage of the situation, as we've seen just the other day, talking about the relation between the Byzantines, the Avars, and the Slavs, especially the one in the middle, right, were quite aggressive, and the Slavs simply joined them and carry out their own migration/invasion, and it depends, really. They were somehow unstable systems. The Slavs didn't really have a state on their own. They had, at best, some kind of a loose tribal confederacy of some sort, some clans. But they would, at this point, be substantially under either the Empire or the Avars, at least in this space. So the point here is determining who are we mentioning as Serbs, because naturally there had been other Slavs that had been migrating from quite a while, since from Roman times, arguably, into the Balkans, into the areas that would become the modern country of Serbia. We also know that the places of origins of these Slavs had been already quite diversified, because there were some western branches, eastern branches that were paralleling, pouring into the empire. The line has been identified roughly as separating these two streams is the Timok Ozogovo Shar one. And we know that the banks of the Morava River, the one in the south, flowing in Serbia, had been settled by a large amount of peoples. The Bulgarian Slavic tribes, specifically of Timosani, the Eastern Obor tribes, and the what we call the Moravians. The Slavs, again, may have been there from quite a while, because we say, again, we mostly identify their migration as saying, okay, well, it's that late 6th, early 7th century, mostly, right, the earliest moment at which they start moving, because basically all the other peoples had moved away by a degree, and now they were just following through either them or as a trail, or just taking their place. Surely from Roman times, even in prior centuries, there had been Proto-Slavic, Slavic warriors around, especially those areas, right? And we know from some archaeological findings of Fibula, etc., that there were Slavs, right, through pottery, mostly pottery finds, living in or around the Roman forts. All right. There is actually no grave that I know that can be, at least with certainty, traced to a Slavic culture. Again, because material culture is quite tricky, as I always say, there's no tag most of the time. You can't look at similarities, and some of them become overwhelming at some point to identify certain groups. But, the material culture is also pretty similar at this point. So we will never have that certainty explicitly, let's say, but these things happened all the time, and the Danubian frontier was particularly, let's say, volatile in a sense. There were so many peoples that had been passing through there that you really never know, right? From the Ostrogoths, the Gepids, all peoples that we made videos on, and the Slavs were already among them by an important degree. So again, the point is not so interesting even to debate, because it's just we know it even without having any explicit evidence, right? But just we can't quantify it precisely, so who cares at the end of the day? Just know that it's the case. So this goes together with dates, places, numbers of whichever kind. We have Slavs also together with Avars, interestingly enough. There are some findings in Serbia that are generally contained and may, say, just talk about a sort of, maybe, I don't know, there were war bands sometimes, and others would have settled down, right? This starts being identified with certainty only from the second half of the 7th century. So we are relatively late, right? Probably 1 century afterwards that, say, relevant Slavs had began to settle there, right? And mostly they're traced, again, because sometimes these Slavs were at somebody else's following, right? And I don't want to be too rigid on this. Of course, there were powerful Slavic chieftains. And again, who were the Slavs? Because if we are talking about the Iranian theory, still these were kind of Irano-Slavic peoples of some sort. But I mean, talking about the elites, the war bands, right? We have seen what Constantine says about these leaders of the white Serbs that, again, were just ready to be on the move in the first place, still in a semi-nomadic context of some sort, meaning at least that they were up to those kind of migrations, right? And as we will see later, probably this migration was more contained than we think. That is to say, probably those leaders were called by Slavs that already inhabited the lands of Serbia, today's lands of Serbia, but that wanted, I don't know, this external ruler because they thought it was stronger and could defend them, and it's still to be fundamentally at their pleasure by a degree. So they had to respect their customs, their laws, or things like that. So we do not know these things explicitly, but there is wide, say, room for speculation regarding whether these being just more specifically just war bands or major demic movements of some sort. Naturally, that in this case, major Slavic demic movements were not, say, I don't know, what the Ostrogothic or the Longobard migration. Those were hundreds of thousands of people each. But still, again, inconsistent numbers for Serbia to be ethnically and politically established as such for the following centuries to see, let's say, or at least for us to see for the following centuries. We see, in fact, that albeit these movements were there, naturally these territories on the right bank of the Danube were not particularly well populated. Right, again, the Danubian frontier had gone depopulated from quite a while. Right, from the other side, like further in Central and Eastern Europe, again, population was even more scarce overall, less dense. So what we see, rather, it's just a quite complex composition, right? So of course there were previous populations, by the way, which are somehow overlooked, especially for Moesia, that was essentially the only Danubian province with a substantial agricultural output, the rest being relatively depressed and fundamentally militarized. I mean, this one was substantially militarized too, but there had been historically, at least prior to the migration, some consistent population. Now that most of this had been disrupted. So what you see, for example, in the 8th and the 9th century is, different, population inloads from surrounding regions. Some areas are not particularly populated. Some groups agglomerate with other on a longer time. Again, we do not know much about the local specific technique, how these things happen politically, the various clans, etc. But we can have an idea of what was going on. Consider this happening at the outskirts of a major power like the Avar Khaganate and the Byzantine Empire were warring against each other. So definitely turbulent areas in the first place, where the Slavs played an enormous role, because they were, at the end of the day, the ones that really inhabited there. So for either of the two to carry out anything, they had they had to receive the Slavic support, right? So from the early 7th century on, right? That is to say, for the first 2 centuries after this initial settlement, there are almost no historical records about the Serbs. Right, that's a problem. As we've seen, the Franks starting to describe them. Eventually, in the 10th century, we have this major information and more at that point. So this tells a lot in general. In terms of the radar of civilization, what these lands really were, because seemingly nobody was particularly interested. Admittedly, as we just said, the Byzantine Empire was undergoing a crisis. These were the 7th century is exactly what you could call the, quote, the darkest age in medieval times. The Byzantines were not really producing sources with a dramatic, critical, analytical, especially at this point. By the 6th century, we're still very, very open-minded in the capacity of just grabbing information and putting it together in something coherent. At this point, there is a dramatic shrinking. The Byzantine literature is generally sclerotic, oligarchic, not properly monarchic, so you don't find this, locals writing and us knowing stuff, no, right? And it's not like in Latin Germanic Europe. So, in other words, the Serbs were dwelling in pretty rough areas. It's what I describe to you often, especially in the series about the, say, Eurasian steppe peoples. You do not want to live in, I don't know, in 7th century Serbia on a regular basis. Right? These are places are tormented by raids, where Slavs are fanatic defenders. They are able to bail out certain settlements in the valley, entrenching themselves in the fortified hilltops, in the forests, in the mountains. They are able to put up a ferocious resistance, retreating into the swamps, carrying out raids, a radically and traumatically violent, brutal, and poor culture in everything, right? One of the single darkest and violent and nightmarish pictures you can really make, right? Mostly trying to survive while bands of nomads come to rape, exterminate, loot the port, race to the ground, and all this kind of stuff, right? This is the say, maybe not the average day in an early Serbian life, but surely it's not very distant from it, right? And just think about the modes. Well, we've seen again in the tactical of the 6th, already in the strategicon of the Southern Maurice, what early Slavic warfare was about. Made multiple videos about that, and that's again one of those things that sometimes you wish you had not read if you are to really properly assess what living like that actually meant. But I guess that this did shape the way they came to the world as a policy. By the way, with all the limits naturally that this condition put to them, but also with a substantial resilience, among other things. So whatever agreement had been made that the Administrando Imperio talks about between Heraclius or whichever other Byzantine authority, because sometimes in the frontier, right, even the local officials had to take quite drastic as important measures, right, to deal with these migrations, invasions, and so on. It seems that the process of the Serbian settlement had finished, right? At least the major movement was done. There were surely other groups that were coming, joining, again, mercenaries, whatever. There were surely, again, Slavic raids, deporting people from other places, bringing them home as slaves, having them work the land, and then eventually merging in, right? So there was, as I was saying before, a previous population there that had presumably remained the majority, even though never underestimate how, again, traumatic all these movements had been, right, for everybody involved. And so the fact that since the areas were already scarcely populated before, such raids, invasions could, especially without a specific settlement, have depopulated entire areas. So generally speaking, for, say, this, the at least as far as the impact that the Slavs had ethnically in these areas, generally speaking, in relative terms, it was higher than you see, I don't know, the Germanic one in Western Europe, for sure, in spite of the fact that, again, some groups were much larger, because, again, every country in the West had millions of people, right, and just living different ways. By this point, the Serbs inhabited mostly the narrow valleys in the watersheds of the West Morava, Lim, Drina, and Bosna rivers, right? They gravitated, as we've seen, mostly for the greater concentration towards the Morava Valley, hence the thing that rings somehow, this may have been the actual greater or Great Moravia, even though the about the Great Moravia, it's mostly the Old Moravia. That's what's meant actually in the Byzantine source, with Megalos being the one that had been let's not digress in this aspect. In any case, that's exactly an area where there had been the greater concentration. I mean, Belgrade is not far from the mouth of the Morava River. From the other side, you have the Iron Gates. I mean, it's all a very strategic area. The say Serbian is very close, so technically, right, that was a hell, as you know, a strategic frontier, massively fortified, and there were substantial settlements. However, the Slavs were mostly inhabiting, as we've seen, inland, right? As most of these peoples kind of giving way to the bigger ones whenever they were able to re-garrison those places and so on, because nobody really cared whoever lived in the countryside. It's, people in the countryside, it's just like in the West, right? Even beliefs or whatever, they were just peasants. Legitimately, nobody gives a damn about what peasants do or think, because they do not have the capacity to do much rather than sheltering themselves, right, in case of invasion. You need, of course, the the support, like at least of the moral majority of this population. So it's mostly in the hands of the elites that rule from other places. And so even though they're starting to be Serbian leaders and so on, the mechanism is incredibly intertwined with surrounding powers as well, right? Then on the east and the Sava on the north, to the Serbians dwell. So you understand they cared about fundamentally having this access to the valleys, and then being also able to withdraw in case of invasion in forest mountains and things like that. At this point, we are sure, because again, the Slavic migrations are a very complex thing. There are Slavs who settled into Africa. They simply picked boats and crossed the sea and settled somewhere in Libya, right? So there is nothing strange to assess that certain Serbian groups at that point crossed the Dinaric Alps, so reaching the Adriatic coast, basically. We know from the Longobard side, actually, that there were some groups that in Apulia that were essentially pushed back into the sea by the local rulers. These things happen all the time. There were a lot, before we mentioned the Narentines, there were lots of pirate nests here and there. I recently made a video about the Republic of Ragusa/Dubrovnik. So that's quite of a Dalmatia, quite of a complex region to look at, but we will do it better on another occasion. The Serbians mostly remain, as you know, a continental power, right? They do not quite venture. It's listed the coastal positions may surely entered some kind of political relation with them, but their center of power was from the other side of the Dinaric Alps. However, when you look at the at Constantine the Seventh's work, we realize that Pagania, Travunia, Zaclumia, etc., are mentioned as Serbians. What does it actually mean, right? Well, it means that probably the Serbians ruled over these centers. Surely, again, there had been some Serbians that had gone there, but these were politically, and that's the only thing that matters, different realities, right? So it's not literally the same thing. We'll talk again about this politics sooner or later, but there is no actual evidence that those had been politics founded by the Serbian migration. No, right? Again, it was full of other people in the first place, and this politics wouldn't take on that Serbian identity for themselves. On the contrary, they likely resented the rule of the Serbian princes, for that matter. Regarding the white Serbian leader who passed down to history eventually as literally the unknown archon, the unknown prince, whatever, as we were saying before, we think that he surely wasn't moving with dramatically large amount of population, right? Surely there was, again, it doesn't make any sense to distinguish a military from a civilian context in these societies, because literally the concept did not exist yet anywhere. but the again, the capacity, right, to create, as it's evident even from the later attempts to establish kind of a overall Serbian rule in kind of towards a unitary direction. These numbers would have not been enough to settle on such a large amount of territory, right? Again, there would have, if so, right, if there had been, again, large migrations already, but those had left greater marks historiographically, right? This thing is just instead more contained, and as we've seen, just occurring mostly because the Avars were a bit busy fighting one another, were greater issues that allowed even this group to move in the first place, and surely not simply, exposing themselves, even as the entire people, to all the perils that crossing, especially the Avar lands, really would entail. So we think mostly that this leadership arrived as a form of military establishment, right? That called perhaps not just by the Byzantines, but by the same Slavs that inhabited already the area, to confer more solidity to, as we've seen, the strategically relevant areas, such as the one of the Moravian Valley, right? So the one that had, over Sirmium and Singidunum, the Longobards and the Gepids had been fighting already. The Avars and the Byzantines were doing so. Again, they were really important areas. So the likelihood here is that there was a need to stiffen, to give a stronger backbone to the local Slavic subjects of the empire, because never forget that we're on the right bank of the river, and that means Roman Empire, territorially speaking, even though, again, this could ideally extend beyond as a universal empire, but those weren't the days of world domination, really, for anyone involved here. And mostly everyone was trying to, however, carving their own spaces, and the Byzantines surely had a major political and territorial capacity to claim, plus the control over until the Danube, right? Now, historical sources reappear, as we've seen in the 9th century, the Frankish ones, specifically saying that they held large part of Dalmatia. As we've seen, here Dalmatia is not really intended in the Roman sense, but in the Frankish sense, right? A broader interland stretching from the Adriatic to the Sava, to the north, and the Drina to the east, right, or the Ibar. By the way, we don't know exactly, right? We just know that the Franks were probably were reasoning like that, and that the area was inhabited by the Serbs, even though the Byzantine sources, as we've seen, are not equally telling, right? Maybe they were not necessarily less interested in the Serbs, which actually was, again, mostly their own thing, as we've seen, but the Byzantines remembered this. But, well, the Franks were a continental empire, and they actually were very interested at that point, especially after having crushed the Avar Khaganate, to push down the Danube from a continental point of view. The Byzantines were more interested in the coastal groups, right? And that's why the aforementioned coastal polities are called like it's the place of the Serbians, because they reasoned like, if you enter deeper there in inland, you will have the Serbians. They're the most important people dwelling there, but it's yet another thing. There are theories here involved regarding especially what a writer like Einar, that, as you know, was Charlemagne's own biographer, would be looking at exactly, because the Serbs are mentioned together with the Croats at least, at this point, and they objectively look similar. As we've seen, the Serbs and the Croats had probably this Western Slavic origin from Central Europe. They had, in this sense, probably been known to the Franks better, as we'll see in a while, because they had migrated from closer places to Serbia, Croatia. And when they settled, were pretty similar, right? You know that Serbo-Croatian is sometimes properly, they say at least they're just different dialects, but very similar languages overall. But and especially at this point it was true, because their cultural divide, the fact one would mostly stay from the western side, Catholic, the other would remain from the other, Orthodox, and so on, more Byzantine, was not yet developed fully at this point, right? So from one side it would be somehow easy to pair these two peoples. On the other hand, what again we think really the Franks were looking at here is, how many peoples they could conquer in the interland, right? It's interesting, for example, but it's still very far away, right, from the Frankish frontier in the first place. As we've seen in the video about the Duchy of Croatia, the Franks wouldn't manage finally to subdue these people. They would manage to maintain them within the Western orbit, the Roman orbit, but it was very complicated even just to go past those areas. The same goes for further inland, with the Danubian, the Pannonian Slavs, for example. We'll talk about them. In the contemporary Vita Ludovici Imperatoris, that is written basically the time of Louis the Pious, right? There are no Serbs mentioned in this broader story, right? And also, the Croats are mentioned, but let's say the Franks stopped. These were at best client states at some point over which the Carolingians could exert some sort of influence, even a domination by a degree, but especially the Serbs were much more inland and difficult to reach. And there was no Carolingian invasion of Serbia for that matter, differently from Croatia. So it's also a large area, as you understand, mostly a mountainous and inaccessible one. This is one of the major features of the land. We're talking about the rugged and high ranges of the Dinaric Alps. So again, very detached even from, again, the Carolingians had much greater interests even against the Byzantines. See the Venetian Lagoon, for example, southern Italy. So these places were just really on the road. And as we've seen, the same Byzantines didn't care so much, and they probably counted on the fact that this area is remaining fundamentally stable, or at least not giving too many problems to the empire, even in case of possible infiltration and so on. Naturally, this is what we know. Surely at the time the Serbians were surely there were some factions which side to pick. There were spies, missions, things like that, to test what this people's allegiance really was, and there was not a political unity of these people. Plus, and typically, the Serbs settled only in certain areas of the land. Right, the best territories were the fertile basins, naturally, but mostly the karst fields, right? What would be known as polia. In fact, also in the toponymy of the land, think about Kosovo polia, etc. And these extensions were somehow contained, right? Generally speaking, they were essentially close to the river valleys that were somehow mutually distant from one another. So again, there were relatively sparse areas, and there were presumably some polities developing there, or at this time following that kind of, say, more intuitive line, right? The thing could be even more fragmented anyway. So these lands were the only truly fertile one, right? So the only ones suitable for agriculture in the first place, while the mountain regions remain uninhabited and mostly just occupied in case of, again, of raids, of major threats incoming, etc. Right? It would be interesting to know even better how the early process of fortifications would occur. But again, the surplus was minimal. Right? These were really poor places, and as a consequence, also the archaeological traces are pretty contained. In the meanwhile, the Serbs weren't just staying there, and the reason being what we just described: the land fundamentally sucked, right? So the Slavs in general, like all the other peoples, like just the Germans, etc., had been leaving the worst lands for the better ones, right? And many Serbs, as many Slavs, scattered all the way to the Peloponnese, right, and other regions of Greece. Bringing Heraclius actually to settle them around these places, and including Thessaloniki, which, as we've seen, was mentioned in spite of the absence of the theme there, yet by Constantine VII. Right? We know that Emperor Justinian II may have resettled some Serbs from the surroundings of Thessaloniki to Bithynia in Anatolia in 688-89. In fact, this deportation would bring to the foundation of the town slash district of Gordoservon. That would actually tell us exactly that, right? Gord in Slavic is the fortress stronghold, and the Serboi, at least here in the Hellenic name, are the Serbs. So this would be the rock, the castle of the Serbs, basically. We know that among the participants to the Quinisext Council in 692 in Constantinople, the Bishop Isidore of Gordoserba was present. This is possibly the first time the Serbs are mentioned in the Balkans. In the first place, I mean, from a source of Southern Europe, actually, which is also interesting in this context, because it tells you how even just, it was common knowledge, right? This with the local priest. This entails, as we will see now, a Christianization in the process, but would be, I don't know, Serbian origin, and they had been settled in Bithynia, and you know that there were the Serbs in the Balkans, and that they had come from Central Europe. So again, they were a relatively notorious people by this point, right? And surely, again, we don't have the sources for the time. At the time, there's plenty of sources that would have told us, even without asking a random person there, how things really were. So the process of evangelization of the Serbs is also fascinating, because, as you know, at least in the history of the country, that takes on a still very so of course the traditional meaning, but also probably the one of martyrdom, the one of very close to the original sense of holy war, and of the extreme sacrifice, and all the rhetoric, also Serbian nationalism and so on, it being founded on that for mostly the Ottomans. But it's something you feel heavily, generally speaking, throughout all Slavic Europe in many ways, even in their art, in their general attitude, in part because they were exposed to this kind of threats and invasions, and so they were also kind of more, generally speaking, more primitive, so they were closer to the tribal, warlike, militaristic mentality, and certain meanings remain more kind of deeply ingrained, at least for a consistent amount of time. The interesting thing we will talk about the white Serbs and the white Croats, by the way, because they have their own history that surely adds other information if you connect them to the migration from Central Europe to the Serbs in the Balkans. Well, these may have been not just already Christianized in part by the time they settled in the Balkans, but they may have actually been some of the earliest Christianized Slavs in the first place. Why? Well, they were on the far west of the Slavic world, right? In the 7th century, those areas had been brought in a way or another under the Merovingian domination, which, of course, was, as you know, a prepotently Christian and properly Catholic power, right? The Franks had skipped Arianism. They had converted straight from paganism into Catholicism, and this was a big deal. Of course, the Slavs, surely there were Christian Slavs or Proto-Slavs at that point, the very first centuries of Christianity, right? People travel, move, know, whatever, right? So it's not really a big deal. But here we're talking about the group as a political community, right? We do not know about the Serbs having been Christianized prior to their migration to the Balkans or whatever. However, at the time, and I made a video about the Thuringi, for example, the Bavarians and the Thuringians that had been brought basically under the Franks during the late 6th century were Christianized, right? The Bavarians were even more Christian. Let's say that this Serbs would have bordered mostly with the Thuringians, right? But they were also very close to longitudinally to the same Merovingians in many ways. So of course there were Christian Serbs moving to the south, knowing, by the way, they would have settled in the lands of the actual Roman Empire. So the empire that is meant to rule the entire universe, and that of course is under the Christian God. So everybody knew this. Again, no people around the Roman Empire didn't think that the Roman Empire wasn't the actual empire dominating the entire universe, right? They believed to be some kind of hypothesis of this gradation of this broader power that eventually was owned by this much bigger of a thing. As we've seen, Constantine VII states that the process of evangelization of the Serbs took place through, at the time of Heraclius in the first place, so again, by the early 7th century, and it was performed by priests coming from Rome, right? The Italian Rome. What we actually know is that the process of evangelization of the Serbs took surely a longer time, right? Other reports confirm that the church missionary activities were organized among the South Slavs already from, but still, the late 7th and the mid 8th century, right? As we'll see, also the Roman connection is probably correct, right? Historically, here, so Constantine VII wanted to stress it. Basically, now the Serbs had been fully Christianized, so they were part of the greater imperial creed, and everything was settled. Now the thing was naturally more imperfect. Let's put it in this way. We know, in fact, that the process would be mostly finished by the mid-9th century. Surely, in the mid-9th century, not all the Serbs were univocally and perfectly, instructed in Christian theology. Let's put it in this way. But we surely do see the first Christian names appearing among the Serbs in a process, of course, of political cooptation and cooperation and fundamental Christianization here. Prince Mutimir, who ruled between 800, say, the mid-9th, and in fact, there was very years until 891, the mid-9th century, 891, and it was famous also for having defeated the Bulgar army, having allied himself also with the Byzantines, and so in fact having established, having started, likely at least given the chronology, the Christianization, named his son Stefan, right? Stefan Mutimirovic, while his nephew was named Petar Gojnokovic. Right. The interesting thing about these names is also the meaning. As you know, Stefan means crowned, right? So the crowning here is literally the divine one of the glorious hero that has achieved the apotheosis on the battlefield. Peter is, again, a bit the Mitraic comparison again of the stone that could literally turn, so the most inorganic thing ever that can transform itself in pure spirit, right? As far as God is concerned, and Peter being, of course, the first vicar of Christ, an imperfect sinner that, of course, redeems himself to sanctity. Multimir, instead, in the Slavic etymology, I think means something like disturber, right? Mostly connected with a sense of, being a restless, painting the behind for all your neighbors, which was something that all these tribes were incredibly proud of, because their entire life was this based on boasting military power and nothing else, as in also the actual universal tradition. As we noticed before, right, for participating to the 26th Council, the Serbs relocated to Gordo-Servan in Anatolia, were Christianized. We are at the end of the 7th century, so this was early enough, but we're also talking about properly the Byzantine Earthland, so something a bit different from Serbia, right? Politically, socially, and so on. In fact, we do not have much of a trace of Serbs or Slavs in the area, or whichever it was, because I don't think we even know exactly where the place is. But say these peoples were eventually absorbed by the main population. Right, and ironically enough, that is the same area from which the Ottoman Empire started, which it's interesting considering, all the mythology of Serbian nationalism, to consider a bit that there may have been some Serb in the same place, or maybe even at the origin some Ottoman power. It's a real thing, right? The Ottomans were born basically within the Roman Empire, and that's as much as the Serbians were in this case, at least the political and territorial reality, even though, as we've seen, the people was coming from somewhere else, just known as Serbs, right? And remaining, because Sorabia, between Czech Republic, Poland, it's still there. Now, when from this period originates the seal of the Prince Strojmir, that is Mutimir's brother, and consider there was yet another brother, Gojnik. These were all ruling a bit jointly. So again, these are the very beginnings of the Serbian principality, and of course, power was very complicated to put together. We've seen it for the Duchy of the Croats, right? They all acted as different. There is a principle of a dynastic principle here, apparently. It was the one of preeminence of some clan that was rising above the others and trying to accomplish something more political and territorially stable. And as we've seen with evangelization in general, that was the goal, right? For the elite to be co-opted by the bigger power to establish a permanent territorial infrastructure, such as the church administration, the monasteries, that were consistent hardware protected by immunities, privileges, exemptions, and in theory they could not be confiscated, because at that point you would have had the entire Christianity against, and much more problems arriving. So these rulers are really, again, it tells you how we know much better about other processes, right? Seeing even greater Moravia, because from the Western sources we can document things better. So here things were happening in a similar way already, just we have less information overall. Now, Strojmir's seal that we were mentioning represents a cross, and in the inscription, Lord help Strojmir, in Greek, obviously, around it. Now, Pope John VIII addressed Prince Mutimir in 873, and he called him in the letter by saying that Mutimir had been following, quote, following the tradition of his ancestors, right? submitting, as we've seen also in the videos about Great Moravia and the evangelization of Moravia and so on, that he submitted his land to the jurisdiction of the new Pannonian bishop Methodius. This was happening in a quite interesting situation, even papal competition with the Franks, even within the same Western, say, the schism had not happened yet, can't say Western Christendom. They were attempting to properly evangelize the Moravians, even autonomously from Rome, than the Carolingians. But initially there were some troubles, and Methodius, that came from, we'll get from the east, right? Was a Byzantine basically, was, however, carrying that out in cooperation with the papacy, and he's given by the papacy. This is the interesting thing. The bishopric of Pannonia and in the area of Serbia as well. So this is quite interesting because it shows how, even though again technically this was still a single empire, even though the Carolingians had de facto incorporated Rome, at least at this point the empire was falling apart, but still Rome would be basically between the two empires, and the empire considered this is always one. Right, the force of it can be summed by our fallen kind to make it one, but let's say technically there is still a single imperium that can never be, let's say, divided. The measure is how up to it you are, and so how much force you get from God in the first place. But the most interesting thing is, again, that the Roman papacy has a hell of an influence over a place like Serbia, or places like Belgrade and Sremska Mitrovica, that, as we've seen, were very strategic. Here we don't know whether Serbia was already the Great Moravia, or whether that was the one in the north. In any case, we know that there were contacts with the northern Moravians, possibly also in virtue of this Serbian migration from the north of the same Moravian lands, by the way, that at this point, in fact, did control those very areas of Sarabia, at least. I'm not sure whether exactly in that year, but later on at the greatest, these are the years at the greatest extent, right, would encompass them as well. So surely there was a connection, lots of things we can't see. It would be interesting too. So the bigger deal here seems the fact that here the Serbian Christianization is carried out by Rome, right? From and by Rome, rather than Constantinople. And again, I can't stress enough how the continental Central European Danubian space was historically much more influenced by Italy than Greece. Right, and this would go on. I made a video about Balkan warfare during the high and medieval, in late medieval times. If you see that, of course, the imports from Norman Sicily, from the Milanese armor, all this stuff in panoply, it was very intense in Serbia. Okay, later times, but still these connections existed. In fact, in Serbo-Croatian, there are lots of Latin derived words because they wouldn't speak Greek before, say they wouldn't be influenced by Greek culture, rather properly by the Latin one, historically. So this proximity, especially in a time in which the Carolingian Empire with Rome had pushed substantially southeast, right, to Pannonia, to Croatia. Well, this Roman interference that, as you know, was also a thing in Bulgaria that was used, right, also aggressively by the local rulers to impose themselves in Constantinople and all this stuff, must not be underestimated. We will talk more about Pope John VIII, because aside the story that he was allegedly a woman, which is false, it's just chit-chat, right, as an insult in the historiography of the time. He was actually a very important pope. And there was a beautiful political factionalism in Rome between the Western Franks and the Eastern Franks. We'll talk it another time, hopefully. But all these international mechanisms are worth, and sure there are more specific studies, but probably further research, right? As far as these Central and European and Balkan powers are also concerned. In fact, again, the Latin loans, even in ecclesiastical, say the Christian terms in the Serbian language, was put in this way, are evident. For example, altare comes from altare, altar, right? The early Christian toponymy and presence of several religious feasts and holidays, which corresponded to the dates in calendar of the Roman Catholic Church in Serbia. For example, St. Vitus Day, that is Vojdovdan, which eventually overlapped with, the celebration of the martyrs of Kosovo-Polia. But Michaelmas, Mioli Dan, Theodore the Studite, Marathon Dan, and so on. So again, the Latin print there is quite interesting. Naturally, there was a Greek influence as well, but again, the information, the influence from Rome was really consistent. In fact, confirmation of the early missionary work by Rome, already in the 7th century, are the contemporary writings of Pope Agato, there weren't others, and the later 13th century source of Thomas the Archdeacon, that was Thomas of Spalato, right, was a Roman Catholic cleric and chronicler from Split, in fact, who tells us a lot of interesting things. I mean, it's anachronistic in ways, and he makes up something every once in a while, but still tells some interesting things about the history of the land, and we will see him probably when talking about Croatian history better. And it was perfectly normal, by the way, there would be such an important Roman influence because this region of still unified church had been traditionally administered by Rome, right? And Rome had in the entire, say, if it could still be considered part of the Byzantine Empire, still had the primate of charity of the entire Christendom. So even before the papal monarchy, and even more in the West, of course, Rome had a radical spiritual superiority over the entire Europe, and this is, again, I made that video about, in fact, the conversion of the Rus of Moravia and the Khazars that exemplifies that. The Byzantines here were managing to win people or two to their closer places, but they had to reach Khazaria to make a score, while Rome was, with the Carolingians, right, Christianizing the wide majority of Central and Northern Europe. And when did things change? Because the Serbians are not Catholic like the Croats; they are Orthodox. Well, things would start changing actually quite soon, in the sense that after 732, that is when the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian, there was all the iconoclasm, made several videos about that, began to transfer regions and cities to the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, including some parts of the Balkans, including Serbia. This is important because, as we've seen, among the reasons of the iconoclasm, that is often just also a bit misunderstood of what actually happened, but part of that was also caused by this sense of, after the first wave of Islamic invasions, this necessity of essentially trying to centralize further, a bit like on the same influence of the caliphs that were following essentially a Roman statal model, to recover in the periphery of the empire all these the provinces as such, and mostly through the church, through the monasteries, especially, were very rich and powerful, and in some areas even of the Balkans had become a sort of chthonic leadership that was continuing the agrarian again, telluric superstitions of the people to carve some sort of local principalities. This was not evidently yet the case in Serbia, but it still encompassed the land. In spite of this, the Roman influence in Serbia was still very strong, and even beyond, even Bulgaria, and until especially the final Great Schism of 1054. And later on, there were other contacts with the papacy. Again, we will talk about this in other videos. In any case, the most important material testimony of the Christianization of the Serbs is the oldest known Christian temple in Serbian lands, which is also a pretty famous and iconic landmark of Serbia. It is the Church of the Holy Apostles Peter and Paul, also just commonly known as the Church of St. Peter's, simply Peter's Church, situated on a hill of Ras, that is, as you know, one of the it would be the capital of the Serbian Grand Principality. There is a famous castle. It's one of the earliest. It's basically the earliest center of power, and meaningfully enough, was this church founded there, right, at this time, exactly in the 7th century, right. There were also other churches built naturally around the same time. For example, the oldest phase of the building of the Church of the Saint Apostles Peter and Paul in Bijelo-Polje, that is in Montenegro, was moved also to the 8th century after some recent studies, and especially the ornaments of the stones, and generally speaking the construction work. Naturally, this would, because it would be normal for these churches to be kept being expanded, enhanced, finished later, right? In that case, even up to the 12th century. Also, you don't have to underestimate, naturally, the fact that there were churches there already when the Serbs moved there, right? There are remains of the 8th century churches before Christianization process. By the way, it includes localities like Bilimice, I think it's pronounced, Zenica, and we thought it was a Byzantine church from the 5th to the 6th century. Dabravina in Visoko, Mali Moshuni in Vitez, Lepenica, Kizerjak, but also there are other churches in modern Bosnia, for example, such as Stolac, Ljubuški, Livnoglamo, Foča, Breza, etc. And also in mosque in Croatia. We cannot know with certainty whether they were when they were actually built, because again the style is very Byzantine in the first place, but they may have been still Slavic, pre-Slavic, Roman churches, whatever. In any case, the general process of evangelization, as it was the normality throughout really the evangelization process in medieval Europe, was peaceful, right? There was surely a pre-existing population, already substantially Christian, that helped together with the Roman or Byzantine monks to complete the conversion. The Serbs, surely there was some conflict triggered by this among the various the Slavic, the Serbian elites. Again, it's always the same. The most powerful wants to centralize, the others don't want, as long as they cite paganism. As soon as they come to power, they become Christian immediately. There surely was some sort of that, but for this region, we do not actually have any evidence of that, right? In any case, the Byzantines didn't need to just to invade this place to force militarily, like the Franks were doing, say, with the Saxons, because this has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with the fact that this was not a people that could oppose itself in the first place, and that had all to gain from actually a quick process of, regimentation within the Byzantine frontier, right? To ask eventually we will see it. The background is of the first Serbian principalities is warfare against the Bulgarians. There were hostilities with the Byzantines as well at point, but generally speaking, again, the centralized position. We want to Christianize, we want to stabilize, we don't want to create any trouble. We want to defend ourselves, we're settled here, we do not basically have even properly the force to invade, to switch, because we're settled here, right? The process of sanitarization is accomplished, and the Christianization shows it also quite clearly. This allowed concentration of power in the hands of the rulers. Christianity conferred this cultural and spiritual dimension, helping accepting the new basic cultural values and principles in that this sedentary and politically more compact context. The Serbians began to read and write. There surely were other. There were surely some runic practice, but it has nothing to do with actual, with literacy as it develops, at least in a civilized reality. So Serbia was included at this point through this religious cultural process that lasted 3 centuries. Admittedly, it wasn't like happening overnight, but still within what we will depict in other videos better as a specific, again, political and territorial space that needed such tools, right? So we started just with that. We will go chronologically. Likely, there is really a lot to say because there are lots of polities and events and issues and so on. So we'll go by degrees and covering, like we do for basically all of Europe, this case the entire Serbian medieval history. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.